Break Fix's History of Motorsports series is brought to you in part by the International Motor Racing Research Center, as well as the Society of Automotive Historians, the Watkins Glen Area Chamber of Commerce, and the Argetsinger family.
In this remastered centered conversation, the International Motor Racing Research Center hosts the Elva reunion at Watkins Glen, celebrating the historic connection between Elva cars and the famous racetrack. The event featured various speakers, including Janos Wimpffen, who authored a definitive book on Elva, and Burdette Birdie Martin, regarded as a leading ambassador for automobile racing and the original Elva distributor for the United States. Both presenters delve into the intricacies of Elva's history, from the inception by Frank Nichols in 1955 to its evolution and key milestones in racing history. Various key figures such as Chuck Dietrich, Haas, and Mark Donahue's early career with Elva are highlighted. This center conversation includes personal anecdotes from racing experiences, descriptions of Elva's marketing influence, challenges, innovations, and its esteemed status in vintage motorsports today.
I'm J.C. Argetsinger, president of the International Motor Racing Research Center, and we are thrilled to have the Elva reunion. Elvas and Watkins Glen go back a long time. Perhaps we can get my brother Michael, who's going to be coming to the podium, to tell you a little story that he had in 1958 with an Elva. We have a number of Elva owners, and I'm going to introduce them in a moment. Now, I know the Elva owners are going to be going up to the track a little later on. Thank you for being here. I've said we have two wonderful speakers here. Janos Wimpffen was our major speaker, who has written the definitive book on the Elva. And we were able to coax Birdie Martin to come out. Birdie, as you know, probably the greatest living ambassador for automobile racing. Delighted he's here. Birdie is the original Elva owner. You know, he was the original Elva distributor. And if you saw our last newsletter or saw Janos's book, there's a spectacular picture of Birdie with the Elva up on two wheels. And maybe he'll tell us what happened. It's frozen in time, and you wonder, did he write it back or did he roll it over? But thank you, Birdie, and maybe you'll comment on that. Anyway, we have this wonderful speaker and this just incredible book. I didn't know that there could be so much material about Elvas. It was so informative and so well researched. The photographs are just terrific, Janos, and I'm thrilled to see it. But I'm not going to say much about these two gentlemen here because Michael Argetsinger, the good-looking Argetsinger and the racing Argetsinger. I'm unfortunately the Argetsinger who had the black sheep of the family, who had a 9-to-5 job. My brothers Michael and Peter have raced extensively. Michael has raced, I probably shouldn't say this anymore because it dates you, but he started when he was 9. He's raced for 4.5 decades, and I think he's raced at something like 7 different countries, 54 tracks, and over 400 races. Not only is he good-looking and he's a great driver, but he has produced 4 wonderful books on the sport, starting with the Walt Hansgen book, which really brings the story of road racing from its inception here in Watkins Glen after the war. And then he picks up with his 2 books on Mark Donahue. Mark was a protege of Walt Hansgen, and Michael brings the story further. Now, our latest book from Michael, which he and David Bull Publishing have given up any profit on it, and it's all for the profit of the Motor Racing Research Center. It is the story of the U.S. Grand Prix here at Watkins Glen from 1960, the 20 years, through 1980. So without further ado, I'm going to turn the program over to Michael R. Argetsinger.
Well, it's great to have a big brother who says nice things about you. That's a nice introduction indeed. I want to tell you what we're going to talk about today, and then I'm going to introduce the speakers. And before I tell you about the program, I want to thank someone who isn't with us but has been really helpful, extraordinarily helpful in putting this together, and that's Roger Dunbar from the UK. Known to most of you, I believe. He really worked a lot behind the scenes, and he almost was able to make the trip. Janos Wimpffen is going to talk a little more specifically about Roger, but Roger, thank you very much. Now, the program today is really exciting, and I just feel terrifically honored to be introducing these 2 people who I admire so much. Our keynote speaker is Janos Wimpffen, who has come from Seattle, and Birdie Martin, as he is known all over the world, came out from Chicago. Janos will keynote it. Birdie's going to come in a couple of times into the middle of the program, talk about some of his involvement. Birdie also was, in addition to having been the original Elva importer to this country, wore so many other hats in American racing. He was the series chief steward for the SCCA's Trans Am in its golden days, 1970, which was the seminal year for that. later was then the series chief steward for the Can-Am, which we all dearly recall. This only touches on Birdie's life. From 1983, actually, to 2006, Birdie was the president of ACUS. ACUS is an acronym for Automobile Competition Committee of the United States. It's a tremendous honor to hold that position, but it's a really difficult job to maintain. The ACUS is the American delegate to the FIA. The FIA, as you know, doles out the international dates, makes all the rules. It's where it all emanates from. And America has many competing sanctioning bodies, but where they come together is in ACUS. They're all on the board, and with a man like Birdie Martin there to keep them all talking to one another, the international dates and so many other things are doled out. Birdie's position with his much-loved Anne, who we dearly miss, ran ACUS, and so many of you, if you applied for an international license during that period, you worked with Anne and Birdie. But Birdie was chief steward at many of the World Grand Prix around the world. He was active in Paris. On the FIA itself, he was vice president of the FIA, in addition to being president of the American delegation, and he was, in fact, the longest-serving vice president that the FIA has ever had. He also headed up the International Records Commission, and the FIA is the ultimate verifier, if you will, of land speed records in general. And Birdie was president of that commission. Again, he was one of the founding members of the FIA Trust. Now, we say chief steward. In Europe, they say clerk of the course. But as I mentioned, many of the World Formula One Grand Prix. And, of course, Birdie operated during that period when Formula One was in a dynamic period. It was a time of great change, of great controversy. We were so fortunate as Americans to have someone who has the wit, the charm, and the negotiating abilities to keep these very difficult groups of people all agreeing to do the right thing. So we're going to hear from Birdie in just a few minutes, and it's going to be a delight. Our keynote speaker will be an equal delight. Janos Wimpffen is one of America's great researchers and writers in the world of motorsport. He has been a prolific writer, and that's really something, to have published as many books as Janos has published, because his books are incredibly well researched. They're in-depth. They're respected worldwide. His background is a PhD, and he's an academic, but really he's a racer at heart, and he is known and admired around the world. He's a third-generation car guy, a member of a historic Austro-Hungarian family. Janos came here at about age 4, so he is, in addition to his love of motorsports, he's a real baseball nut. Janos has been to more minor league ballparks around America, and I think all but maybe one or two major league parks. And even on this trip, he's already got to the Syracuse Stadium and the Buffalo one. So he never misses a chance. He loves minor leagues equally with the majors. Interesting family. His grandfather held the Austrian driver's license #1. And in fact, in taking the test, he had to give the instructions to the Vienna policemen because they had no idea what they were examining. He learned great engineering skills from his father, mechanical aptitude from his brother, and he did some club racing. And he says that taught him he didn't have driving skills of Austrians such as Lauda and Rindt, but we could all say that we didn't have talents like Lauda and Rindt. He has been consulting all over the country. In addition to his writing, he's a consultant regularly in Naples, Florida for the Collier Museum, for the Bruce McCaw Collection, and others. And he is sought after by car owners and historians literally all over the world. I am very proud to be a friend of Janos's as well as fellow author, and we share the same publisher, David Bull Publishing. And we were together in Beverly Hills this past December at the Peterson Museum for the Motor Press Guilds Award, the Dean Bachelor Award. And David Bull, to his great credit, had 2 of the 3 finalists, and the winner was Janos. I really have so much more to say about both of these men, but you really want to hear them. So I am going to ask Janos to come to the podium.
Thank you very much, both to Michael and JC. In fact, JC's little issue there with having additional Elva owners, I'm so familiar with that syndrome that you work hard on something and then when it's actually out there, all of a sudden more information comes your way. It's always actually a pleasure rather than a problem. In fact, of course, here it's a pleasure that we have additional Elva owners. I found that from the very first book that I did, which is called Time in Two Seats, that once I finished that and people started coming forward, well, you either got this wrong or you forgot about this or here's some additional information on this or that race. First time that happened to me, I was kind of a little discouraged, like, oh, did I drop the ball here or something like that? And more often than not, I would be comforted by other people saying, no, you got it all right, but next time around, here's a little extra added information. And that's interestingly part of this whole process of discovery, I call it. I get asked a lot about sort of the writing process and the creative process, publishing process. All these have a lot of little nuances to them, which I can go on for hours. It's maybe a separate topic altogether. But I think at the core of this is really the joy of learning. Just like those little tidbits that come to you after the fact, I've learned that what really is the joy of that is you learn something new. There's no such thing as an old dog doesn't learn new tricks. That's how we enjoy getting older, is learning more each day. And hopefully that gets incorporated into these books. It certainly is the case with Elva. I didn't know much about Elva to start with. I know a lot more now. There's still a lot more to know about it. This morning people were coming up to me and giving me extra little bits, whether it was about their car or interesting tidbits they accumulated that I didn't know about. Always a process of learning. The other maybe issue of why do we do what we do, that is, have an interest in motorsport history, and is it really worthwhile? After all, it's not rocket science. We're not discovering a cure for some disease, something like that. How important is it to society? Well, true, it doesn't rank up with some of those other very valuable enterprises that people undertake. But it is important when you think that the automobile is the 20th century's most significant technological achievement. It changed everything. From the 19th century to 20th century, it was a sea change. Most of that came about because of the automobile. Not all of it good, mind you. There were utopias and dystopias created at the same time. And in some small way, that's what we're looking at. We're looking at that history, that 20th century, and the most significant part of it. We're looking at, from a motorsports point of view, particularly from the recreational element of it, which is a major part of automotive history, was how it was used as a recreational tool. That's not insignificant, but it's also important to have fun while we're doing it. And, of course, we're all having fun while we're doing it. This is, by the way, a conversation I often have with a friend of mine in the UK, Doug Nye, who you may know of his books. He's also a very well-known historian, motorsport historian. Whenever we sometimes share a podium and talk about these sorts of things, and his sort of thing is, well, we in England don't do this kind of navel-gazing. We just get on with it, have a lot of fun. And he's got a really good point about that. Just one other comment about the creative process in general, and we'll get to the meat of the talk here. That, and this is again because I periodically get asked this sort of thing about, well, how do you do these things anyway? I don't know if this would apply to Michael as well in his creative process. And just like in any enterprise that you undertake, any kind of work, you hit roadblocks, you hit problems, you go, how do I write this next paragraph, this next chapter? In my case, it's usually the next caption to a photo. Those are, to me, are always challenging. And you hit roadblocks, and sometimes you want to practice iron discipline. I'm going to sit here at the keyboard until I get this right. Just like you practice sometimes iron discipline at fixing the leak in the kitchen sink. You're going to get it done now, no matter what happens. And what often happens is you break the nut or whatever it is, or you're working on a car, you break the nut off rather than accomplish it. So you have to sort of step back from that. And I kind of call it the pleasure principle of creativity. I've only lately learned that there's actually a neuroscientific aspect to this. I don't know all the details of that, but you have to step back and do something that's ultimately very pleasurable, that doesn't involve a lot of brain activity necessarily. Relax and let the creative process flow through you. Let the two things connect that have never connected before. My personal preference in that is a morning shower. Think of how many times in the shower in the morning you might be dwelling on what you have to do that day, but it's a very pleasurable moment. Nobody's bothering you. You're by yourself. You get to think about what you're doing during the day, and you inevitably connect two dots that never been connected before about your particular problem of the day. I use that a lot in the creative process. Day before, I'm stuck on some paragraph. The next morning in the shower, I go, oh, that's a solution to that. Sometimes by the time I get to a pad of paper, I've forgotten what it was, but that's very much part of the creative process. And like I say, I understand from neuroscientists that there's actually a part of the brain that goes into play at those times and works on connecting those dots. The publishing process is a different sort of thing because that involves a lot of give and take. Michael mentioned he and I are really, truly privileged to share what I consider absolutely the best publisher in the world as far as motor racing, motorsports books, and that's David Bull. I think Michael has maybe a little different relationship with him than I do. David is very exacting, and he and I have had years and years of debates, just hours and hours worth of debates about how to do sometimes literally a particular sentence, position a photograph, something like that. And there's a lot of give and take on that, but at the end of the day, the product wouldn't be the product without somebody like David Boland. A lot of tribute to him. Quick tribute to a couple of people that I've gotten to know, particularly here in the center, because this is not the first time I've been to the center. I think there's people like Bill Green, who has just been marvelous in terms of helping me put together a lot of the data that goes into this. I've been privileged to meet people like Max, Misha, Randy, Kevin, Josh, Glenda, all the other people involved in this center. You have a treasure here that's amazing. A treasure not only in the facilities, but a treasure in terms of the people that are here. They're a marvelous group of people who are really committed and do a good job. That people thing is also, by the way, something that I think drives a lot of this history. Yes, the history of motorsports and automotive history in general is one about lug nuts and torque settings and carburetors and the like, but it's really about the people. On all of this, the histories of the people involved, people like Birdie Martin sitting here, and characters left and right, are really what this history is ultimately about. That's what we carry on in the next generation, to tell the stories of the people who were involved. There were good people, not so good people, characters of all sorts. And in all the work that I've done, I've discovered I go into it with sort of a nuts and bolts approach. And at the end of the day, come out of it, the respect is really for the people. As for Elva, why Elva? Well, maybe a little bit of an introduction to Elva for those of you. I know there are many Elva owners here who know it in many cases better than I do. But for those of you who may not be familiar with the Elva mark, Elva was a British mark that existed for a very short period of time, from roughly 1955 to roughly 1965, although there's a little bit of fading in and fading out before and after that, but really for a short period of time. It was a contemporary of other makes such as Cooper, Lotus, Lola, particularly those and a few others, rival to those. It came out of a particular milieu of the early 50s British scene. The economy in Britain wasn't that strong, but the technology was there, and again, in terms of the people, there was a lot of expertise into how to go about things, and we'll see a little bit about that. And that's just a very, very short overview of what Elva is as a mark. It's a unique mark. In many ways, it's both unique and it's also typical. It's typical of that time in England, different automobile constructors. Won't really call it a manufacturer, but it's also unique because it has its own particular peculiarities. I came into this project actually somewhat later down the line. I didn't originate the project. The project was originated by two fellows, one of which mentioned before, Roger Dunbar in England, and Jeff Allison in Colorado. They had undertaken to produce the history of Elva and did an amazing amount of legwork. They interviewed many of the key people. Thankfully, they interviewed some of the key people who are no longer with us and passed away before I got involved in the project. They did a lot of the nuts and bolts work involved in getting the information, but they never got around to actually writing it. So I came in, I was asked to do the writing of the book, which of course then, as I said before, got me involved in learning as to what Elva was. I mean, I had a rough idea before, but to learning the real nuts and bolts of Elva, and sort of took it over from there. There's really one person behind Elva more than anybody else, and that's Frank Nichols. Frank grew up in Sussex County, south of England. He was the son of a grocer. He was in the Army in World War II, served in El Alamein, was injured at El Alamein, and gained a lot of mechanical skills during the war, brought those back to England after he mustered out. So he's in the south of England. Bexhill's the name of the village, which is very close to Hastings, where William the Conqueror landed in 1066, so kind of a historic area. Also historic automotively. That's where one of the very first automotive competitions took place in England in 1903. So he mustered out of the military, out of the Army, and quickly developed an interest in automotive things because, as I say, he developed the skill. He opened up a garage repairing cars called the London Road Garage on London Road in Bexhill, and quickly became interested in racing. And this was where I would say Elva, this is a common occurrence that time in England. Young men develop mechanical aptitude during the war, now have a little bit of spending money, maybe develop some kind of an enterprise related to automobiles, and get interested in motor racing. Frank did that. He drove a Ford 10, which is a very common car of that era in racing. He also drove a Lotus 6 with a Ford 10 engine in it. Modest success. His driving skills were never that particularly great. But he quickly became involved with a fellow named Mack Witz, and also indirectly with Harry Westlake, who you may know the name from a lot of automotive development in the 1960s. They developed a very unique part of the power plant, in addition to the Ford 10, a hop-up kit, if you will, an inlet over exhaust valve kit that you could put on the top of the Ford engine, increases power a little bit. As a result of this, he also decided, well, I should really commission a car to go with this inlet over outlet head, and that was called the CSM, the Chapman Sports Motor Car. This is a one-off car, and the CSM Special was quite fast, again, because of his driving, didn't necessarily win a lot of races, but was lightning fast, attracted a lot of attention. People want to know, well, how can we get the same thing? So he ended up going into business selling those kits that you saw, the inlet over exhaust kits. And those actually became a mainstay of the company for a number of years. They were sold up until roughly 1960-61, about the time that that engine, the Ford 10, really became obsolete, no longer used. But they were popular, sold all over the world. Not yet Elva. The term Elva really wasn't born yet at this point. But of course, people liked this concept. And they wonder, well, where can we get one of these? So he decided to go into production, actually producing what became known as the Elva. Well, the Elva name, initially was just going to be the LRG car for London Road Garage, not a very pleasant name. At one point, he had this friend, Bill Murphy, Bill's brother Jim, looked at the car one day and said, Elva, the French for she goes. And then it was contracted to ELVA, and thus we're forever have the name Elva. Fairly crude, almost cycle fender car. It was very much, again, the image of that era. Kind of a kit car, but now becoming a little bit more sophisticated. Orders came in fairly quick on this. This was indeed a very successful car. It was successful at this point no longer for Frank Nichols, because he was out of driving himself. It was taken over by people such as Richard Mannering, a fellow who was tragically killed in the Tourist Trophy in an Elva. It was actually the first of, I believe, 4 fatalities to ever occur in an Elva. Now the orders began to expand. There's another innovation here on this car, and that is a fiberglass body. Not all of the early Elvas have fiberglass. Many of them were aluminum, but that was, again, kind of an innovative concept at the time. Frank wasn't trying to be technically advanced. He was always looking at everything from a price point of view. And that's actually one of the things that sets Elva apart from some of his contemporaries, Lola, Lotus, Cooper, and the like. Frank was this kind of a stingy sort of fellow, and he liked to build things to cost. The others, Lotus, typically would be going for speed, and consequently the Lotus cars were famous for being difficult to drive. Elvas were something easy that you could get into right away. But because of this kind of stinginess, there were several factors about this. One of them was that there were never any Elva factory racing teams, or really nothing that you could really directly point to an Elva factory racing team. There was adequate servicing. In fact, he was known for being very good with communicating with the purchasers out there. The technical advances were kind of slow in coming. It was many, many years before he would introduce things such as disc brakes. But everything was always focused on this price point of view. There was also another important element, and this is more external matters than internal. The home market in England was never particularly strong, or at least not strong in the early years. This has also coincided with the Suez Canal crisis, when there was particularly a clamp on the English economy. So it became a period of export or perish. In order for any small manufacturer, small constructor like Elva to survive, they really had to export. Quickly looked at the American market. Well, one of the benefits is that the car got really good reviews in the English press. And, of course, the English press was fairly widely read, or at least read as a cult matter in the U.S. And one of the people that picked up on that was a fellow named Chuck Dietrich out of Sandusky, Ohio. Chuck bought one of the first Elvas into the U.S., not one of necessarily the very first one, but one of the first in North America at least. And he became quickly one of the champions of Elva. For years and years, he was one of the main importers, and there are actually many importers and dealers, and it's a very convoluted story in that regard. Became one of the many people involved in this early stage, one of the key people. Chuck actually stayed with the marque for many, many years. In most cases, he was actually imported the very first of each of the successive models. He did later on sort of veer away and took a little vacation and drove a Bobsy for a while, and then returned again to Elva in later years. He was a very key figure in the early part of this. Another key figure who you'll meet in a moment here will be Birdie Martin. But before Birdie, there's also Frank Bike. And he had a very unusual car. This was a car that had a Chevy V8 crammed into this. My understanding is the car went great in the straight line, but not much else. And that was another thing about Elvas. There were always all kinds of experimentation that went on. We're moving now kind of into the Mark II era of the Elva, and as you can see, it's starting to get a little bit more streamlined, a little bit more sophisticated. Didion suspension comes into play. You'll see shots of these very distinctive Elva black mag wheels that remain distinctive for Elva for years to come. Another thing about these cars is that when we talk about these changes in design and all that, all this was done in a very, very kind of intuitive way. Keith Marsden, who was the main designer you saw in that earlier shot, he basically just drew chalk lines on the floor, and that's what the chassis was built around. There were no drawings, certainly no computer-aided design kind of thing in those days, nothing of anything from more modern period. In fact, Keith Marsden is kind of an interesting character in and of himself because he really enjoyed this kind of work. And in later years, when a company called Trojan came into play and took over some of the Elva production, and it became more of a corporate environment, didn't suit Keith Marsden particularly well, and he left the company at that point. But he was a critical factor in these early days. To give you a little bit of a flavor of what this is like, a fellow out of Washington, D.C., Walter Dixon, becomes involved with the Elva enterprise, and with somewhat chaotic results at that point. But when he became involved, he sent one of his people over, Arthur Tweedale, who himself was an expatriate Brit, back over to England to have a look at the Elva factory and report back as to what it was like. Tweedale goes over there and comes back and reports to his boss, Dixon, and said, well, there's a couple welding torches over there, and there's a couple guys assembling things over here, and there's a radiator guy over here, and engine guy pulling in the engines over here. And somehow in the middle of this, the cars just happen. And that's very typical of this. It's sort of another side of this, which is also so typically English. When Michael and I were in Los Angeles back in December, we were very happy to be interviewed by Jay Leno on his website, not on his TV show, but on his website. And part of that, Jay had a lot of comments. In fact, in the segment where he interviews me, these comments didn't quite make it into the final cut. But it's funny because Jay started telling stories, as only Jay Leno could, about his own experiences with English manufacturers. And he said he understood when I would point out these things about how quirky the English are about things. He goes, oh yeah, well, one time I had to call over there for some parts for one of his cars. They said over there, we're kind of busy right now. Could you call back later? And he's thinking, like Thursday or Tuesday or something like that. And he said, well, when should I call back? He said, well, maybe next November. And that's so typically English. And then he would go over and visit, and he goes, yeah, there's a tea kettle here, and they're too busy having tea to bother with things like getting to your part right away. Another instance like that where he called over for some part, and they said, oh, no, we don't make that part anymore. He says, well, why not? He says, we were getting so many orders for that, it was such a bother that we just stopped making the part. And I thought, what could be more English than this? And this suffuses so much of Elva history. So the Mark II things are getting a little bit more sophisticated, but it's still very much the intuitive chalk marks kind of thing. One of the things here is the engine types. I mentioned earlier on that the Ford engine was kind of commonly used on the very early Elvas. That changed fairly quickly because really the engine to have in those days was the Coventry Climax FWA. featherweight 1100cc engine. That was really the thing to have. So for a while, these Mark IIs and the like, most of them came with the Coventry Climax engine. There were all kinds of variants in there. A couple people had a Maserati and a few Alfa Romeos and the like. But the Coventry Climax became sort of the most common thing. Well, one of the problems with the Coventry Climax was that at that point, Lotus was also becoming a big power. Lotus was a competitor to Elva, and they were trying to put the kibosh on Elva getting, and anybody else getting the Coventry Climax. So Frank Nichols had to look around for other suppliers. And one of the people he came to talk to was a fellow by the name of Archie Butterworth, who's one of the most colorful characters in this whole story. Archie also, by the way, learned many of his skills during the war. In a very unusual way during World War II. He was in charge of inventorying and studying captured material from the enemy. So by studying these, you, of course, then be able to give information back to his superiors as to how to better improve the British armaments. And at one point there, he was sifting through some of the material, and a German bomber came over and started strafing that area. And in typical British fashion, he goes, "Oh, this is so bloody annoying." And he's scrambling around, reaches down, picks up this Luger that's lying on the ground, points the Luger up at the belly of the plane, boom, shoots it, and down comes the plane, and for which he won several awards for that. So that's the kind of character he was. Later on, when he became involved in automotive things, he had good mechanical abilities, built a really interesting car with an interesting engine, handled like garbage. He ended up selling that car to Bill Milliken, who we heard about before, revered Bill Milliken here. Bill basically bought that car as a good study of what not to do. So he learned that from Archie Butterworth. Archie also was known for carrying a fully stocked bar in the boot of his Jaguar, and first thing he'd do when he'd arrive at a race circuit would be to, of course, open that up. So at this point now, we're still kind of early in the Elva history. They've really only produced a few hundred cars. Many of them now are coming to the U.S., though. That's a big, big part of the market. So there's still very few cars, but now we've got a couple of Americans have become deeply involved in this. I mentioned Chuck Dietrich. Another fellow was Carl Haas, very, very major player in this. He became an importer in the Midwest. And another fellow was Birdie Martin. And since Birdie is here, I'll let Birdie talk about his particular era as far as Elva goes.
Janos's talk here was so interesting, I'd like to rush through what I'm going to say to hear more about what he has to tell about. I've got a few little comments I have to make, and I was reminded today of something that Chris Economaki told me one time when he was hired to do one of his first major race events. He was looking forward to it, and he'd studied, what to talk about and so forth. So as they came on the air, the other man that he was working with, I don't recall which one it was, but he was a well-known sports announcer and play-by-play man and so forth. And they started off, and this other fellow said, "Chris, tell me, what are we going to see here today?" He went into the study he had done. He said, "Well, you're going to see they've just changed the ride height on these cars. They've done some other things here to allow less fuel consumption." He said, "We've got some new drivers here." He went on and named a number of things that would happen. All of a sudden, the technical people said, "Cut, cut." Chris said, "What's that?" He said, "Well, we're just doing a preview of the opening. That was just it. But we're now ready to go on live. So let's go back and start again." So the fellow comes on, who's the network announcer, didn't know very much about motorsport, but he said, "Well, ladies and gentlemen, we're here today, and we're going to see these cars are running with new fuel rules on it, and they've got this, and they've got that, and they've got everything." And he repeated everything that Chris Economaki had said in the warm-up. And then he turned to Chris, and he said, "Now, Chris, what do you think?" Chris told me I didn't know what to say at all. That's kind of the way I feel right now. I think, Janos, you've told a lot of good stories here that I might have been counting on, but with Elva and Nichols and so forth, there's a lot of them. Also, I have to say, after I heard Michael introduce us and JC, I thought, geez, I wish I could go and listen to those two guys. They must know what they're talking about. I was very fortunate. I lived in a great era. I was 21 years old in a great era and a great time to be living in motorsport and so forth. I look out and I think these are Elva people. I don't remember Elva people looking this old. Because we dealt with guys that couldn't afford a Lotus at the time, and maybe they could get a Elva or something, and they were all pretty much younger guys just starting out. Many of them went a long way, too. Unfortunately, we've lost many of them in recent years. I have the excuse that a couple months here I'm going to be 83 years old. Fortunately, I feel very good. I feel my health feels very good. My doctors tell me I'm pretty good and so forth. I hope to be around a good bit more because I really have had a wonderful period of my life here. Not many people can spend every day working on their passion, which is motorsport and cars and people. And that gets to another important part of it, people, and that's what it's all about. And the Elva people were very unique. They were quite different than people that bought Lotuses and that. And a few of the people that bought Lotuses swung over and bought Elvas and that. They didn't have the same engineering and the same background as Lotus might have had, but it was interesting. I have to touch a bit on Frank Nichols, too. You went into his youth and so forth. But I was over in England in 1953, right after the war was over. I visited some of the people over there. In fact, I bought an engine in Italy for a friend and did a few things. And I visited with John Cooper. At that time, I met John, and I believe I met Frank at that time, but I didn't make a big impression. He didn't have an Elva name on him or anything, but we referred back to that time. I did remember, though, at that time, that John Cooper said to me, I want to show you something. We just got the first one, and it was the FWA Coventry Climax engine. And he just had gotten the first one, and as most of you all know, that was really a variation from a water pump that was developed during the war, during the Battle of Britain and so forth. And it was a very light engine for a pump that could really put out some water, and it was very effective. And that's why they built an overhead cam type engine for it. He showed me that engine, and little did I know how much that would be a part of my life in a few more years, because I ended up being a distributor for not only the Elva, but for Coventry Climax parts and so forth. Even had Weber carburetors at one time, too. I started my own racing actually in 1947, in the very early years, right after the war. Andy Granatelli in Chicago, where I lived in that area. Andy formed a group called the Hurricane Hot Rod Association. I had one of the first hot rods in Chicago, 32 Highboy Ford. So I joined that. And Andy was a great politician. He got us an opportunity to run at Soldiers Field in Chicago and even got us a $1,000 purse to run there. It turned out that this hot rod racing really caught on. And that first race at Soldiers Field, we had 40,000 people attend. And they probably paid $1.25 or something to get in, but the promoter made an awful lot of money. And I can tell you that the second time we raced there, we got 40% of the gate. Andy learned that very quickly. And that was kind of an interesting thing. I went off to college, and first day I got down in Albuquerque, I was going to the University of New Mexico. I walked down the street. I went by a garage, and it had a midget racer inside there. Well, I went in and I told him that I was a great hot rod racer from Chicago and so forth. I found out these fellas had just bought this midget and they didn't have a driver yet. So I got a job driving while I was in college there, drove for them for about a year or so. I remember the first time we went out to test. I knew that you held the brake on a midget and they pushed you off and your wheels were locked up, and once it got moving a bit, you take the brake off. And I knew all that so that it looked like I knew what I was doing. I made about 2 laps and spun. I came in and they said, what happened? And I said, well, I'm used to driving on blacktop. I'm not a dirt driver, really. And so I got by that. Had a lot of fun. I made some money while I was going to college. And, of course, I couldn't tell my parents that I was making this kind of money because they wouldn't like the idea that I was driving race cars, and I hadn't told them that yet. Anyhow, they eventually accepted it all. In fact, they went to one of my first races in a sports car. I bought an MG TC, went to a race up at Wilmot Hills, which was a brand new facility they had just bought or had leased it for a number of years. I drove the TC in the race. I think I finished back about 4th or 5th or something. I broke my tail driving that car as hard as I could, and I got home, and my father said to me, he said, son, he said, I like the way you drive. You're very consistent, and you're not rushing at all. And I thought, there's something wrong about this because I was trying awful hard. Anyhow, Frank Bike was one of my very good friends. We went to high school together and so forth, and he was a very close friend. Frank was very mechanically inclined and very handy in the shop, and he did machining, he did designing and everything else. He came from a family that produced candy, and they were a very famous family in the Chicago area, maybe around the country in those days, the Whiz Bar, which was a chocolate marshmallow candy and that. But he was very good at things, and he had picked up an Austin engine. I think it was an A40 or something like that, Austin engine, and he was doing a complete job on it, porting it and everything else. I said, Frank, what are you going to do with it? He said, well, I've seen an ad or a little article in a magazine, a British magazine, and there's an Elva car there. And he said, I think maybe that's something I could use to put it into. In fact, I'm not sure it even had the name Elva yet. I said, geez, that sounds interesting. I said, let me go, I'll write a letter back to them and give me the address, and he did. And so I wrote back and wrote to Frank Nichols, and he sent me some stuff and on the car. I said, why don't we buy that, and then we'll buy another complete car with an engine in it. And so I wrote back to Frank Nichols, and Frank said, listen, we just got the first of these Coventry Climax engines, and he said, this is the hot setup. Are you still interested in two cars? I said, yeah, but one of them we don't need an engine for. We just need the one. And he said, but you're going to buy two? I said, yes. In those days, we sent telegrams, too, you know. He came back, and he said, you're buying two, so you're now the dealer for that area. So he told me that he had dealt with Chuck Dietrich. And I knew Chuck because I had raced MGs against him and Susie, his wife, and that. I said, that's great. We'll work together on this, and I'll help, and we're going to get some parts and stuff in and so forth. And Chuck was a good friend and a very accomplished driver. Very, very good. The market area in Chicago at that point, economy was pretty good and so forth. It was a lot better than it was in Sandusky, Ohio, where Chuck was located. So I think we sold a lot more cars, and he did a lot more racing. The problem for me was when these two cars came over, and you saw the one that Frank Bike ended up putting the Chevrolet engine in and took 5 years to finish it, and the other one, when it arrived, Frank Nichols came over at the same time to the United States, and he was going to visit us and visit somebody in Texas that had been writing to him. So we arranged to meet Frank at the airport in New York when it arrived, and we picked up the car the night or so before and got it loaded and on a trailer and so forth. We went and we met him at the airport, and he said, I'm going to Texas, and then I'm going to come back to you all because you'll be on the road going back to Chicago with this. So he said, could you take me over to Newark Airport? I said, sure, that's no problem. We can do that. So we went over to Newark Airport, and we were asking a lot of questions about what was happening in the racing scene. And believe me, in England, the 1100 G-modified, we called here in the United States, was a hot class over there. I mean, they had the future race drivers driving in that. So we're talking about the racing, and waitress comes back and brings breakfast that we had, and Frank got his grapefruit, and it had a sparkler sticking in it, and it was glowing like this. And I always remember that because Frank said, I really don't know. He said, is this how you eat grapefruit over here? Other than his war ventures, which I don't think got him to very many nice restaurants, he hadn't really been in a place that was a little fancy. So anyhow, we did that. Frank came back from Texas. I don't think he was terribly successful with that venture, but anyhow, he came back and we met him in Chicago. We had a great time with Frank. We talked about what he was able to do and what he did. He wasn't really a great engineer, but he was capable. But he didn't reckon that he was an engineer anyhow. He figured that's somebody they'll have to hire or use who he already has. But there was something about Frank that you had confidence in him that he could do what he was saying he was going to do. And he had plans. He wanted to run right up there with Lotus and with Cooper and so forth. And I have to tell you, even in his greatest success, well, Colin Chapman, he died. I actually talked to him a few hours before he died. I was in Paris at the time, and he was coming out of a meeting of the what was the FOCA at that time, the Formula One people. I was with Max Mosley and a couple other people. I knew Max from Watkins Glen here and that. Chapman was never very accommodating to anybody. I mean, he almost thought you had to have a slot where you could put a quarter in, and then he would talk to you or something. Years later, when Lola was first coming along and started to win all the races in England, I remember I asked him at Sebring that year, what do you think about this Lola car? He said, oh, it's fly-by-night. They just built a couple cars, and they're not going to matter. They're not going to mean very much, which was interesting because a third friend that I went to school with at that time was a fellow by the name of Al Ross, who was my mechanic. And he wasn't a very good mechanic, but he was a good worker, which you really need at that point. And he imported the very first Lola into the United States. He didn't tell me, in fact, until after it was well on the way. And I went with him, in fact, when he cleared it through customs in Chicago. It was a supercar, but I always thought of what Chapman had said earlier that year when I talked to him about it. Frank was always very good about people, but he recognized he was working his way up in the pecking order of motorsport. But he did very well. He impressed a lot of the journalists. I don't know, he got some really good write-ups on his things and that. Did very well with that. It was an interesting time, and I started to say, when these cars came over, it seemed like Frank Nichols would always come over because he knew he'd get another order from me when he came over. And I would generally take that new car that I just got, which was like the Mark I that we ordered complete with an engine, and I would sell that car because I wanted the later one. And then I'd get the later one, and then I would sell that one because somebody else would buy it, and I would get the newer one all the time. But I did squeeze a few races in on some of them when they were new, and I was very fortunate, and it did pretty well. And the truth of the matter is the success of Elva was the fact that the people that got them were people that were willing to work on them, willing to learn how to set it up. Frank really delivered you a car that was complete in all the pieces, and they were all bolted together one way or another. He didn't really do an awful lot. Most of the guys that were driving Elvas in England even were guys that were doing all their own work and that. There were no big factory teams, as Janos just said. It brings back an instant later on after the Dixon era when we were going to run an actual team at Sebring. And Dixon arranged everything. He arranged the rooms for the cars and the mechanics and everything. And I sold 2 of those cars to 2 people that each were going to drive them at Sebring and was part of the Lola team. Another interesting point, Frank was a really good public relations man, too. From those first cars we bought, when he shipped them over here, they had our names on the doors, all written by a sign painter, really done nicely, which was kind of neat. You really thought that was nice. You might have liked to have done it, but in those days you probably wouldn't do that on your own. People would make a big issue. But when they came on an Elva with your name on them, generally was pretty nice. And if you got one that you didn't buy ahead of time, but you bought it from the dealer, you would also get somebody who's put their name on the same way because it was pretty common on the Elvas at that time. I had a Mark II that I drove. I had a Mark III that I drove. I had one of the first Mark IVs. Generally, he would send Chuck and I the first cars that would come out until he got Dixon involved, and then Dixon would get the first cars there. But I got a Mark IV that year, and that was 1959, and I got it earlier in the year, I believe, because I raced it several times. Actually, it's the one I sold to Bill Jordan at the time that was the Sebring car. That Mark IV, when I saw it, I knew exactly where he got the design for it that I had, an Abarth 207. I had that, and when Frank first came over, he saw that car. He really liked the looks of it. That is where Frank got the idea for the knife edge on the bodies of the Mark IV cars. And it so happened in 59 that those were the cars that we were going to race at Sebring. And you could always tell those because they had an extra set of headlights built into the bonnet of it. We picked up ours, went with Bill Jordan and I and his wife, and we went to Washington to pick up the Mark IV we were going to drive at Sebring. They were bringing down the other one that I had sold and one that was going to be driven by Frank Batista, who was the national champion in G-Modified, was a very good Lotus driver, very good. Arthur Tweedale was going to be the other one who worked for Dixon also. They were bringing those cars down. We went to Dixon's place there in Washington, or Baltimore, I guess it was, and got the car and that. We got down there, and First time we took the car out, it handled terrible. It was awful. And Frank was there, had arrived and got down to Sebring. A fellow that I knew very well, who was a Lotus driver, who was very good mechanically, was down at Sebring, and he wanted to help us set up the car, and he was very good in setting up the front end of the car. But I always remember his name was J.C. Kilburn. He was from Rockford, later moved down to Dallas, Texas, and that still races at Monterey and that, in a junior, I guess. He told me that, he said to Frank, what kind of camber setting do you set up on the front end? And Frank said, how the hell should I know? I only make the cars. I don't set them up. And that was typical of him. Listen, I'll skip on and come back a little later. Sorry to take up your time.
Delightful indeed. And, Birdie is touched on, of course, the name Walter Dixon, who's a major player in this, not always in the best way. One of the key things that happened with Walter Dixon, as Birdie mentioned, he's actually a Washington area, Baltimore, Washington area dealer of a number of different cars. In an early meeting with Frank Nichols, suggested to him that, you ever thought of something like an MGA? MGAs were quite popular at the time, very successful car. And that you might want to consider building something like an MGA. And Frank thought that was a really good idea. That's what became then the Courier. So the Courier was really born out of a discussion between the two, and that became the production car that later actually, to some extent, led to a temporary downfall for Elva. Continuing on with the story here, I just wanted to quickly mention Archie Butterworth. And there's another key person in that particular period, and that's Archie Scott Brown. It's a tale of two Archies. Archie Scott Brown was one of the real iconic English drivers of that era, and he was, as far as the Elva saga goes, he drove several Elvas of the particular Mark IIIs, and he was also one of the few who could drive this Butterworth engine car. Archie was born with only a stub of one hand. Left hand was fine, right hand was just a stub, and yet drove in an era long before political correctness and all that. He was a very successful handicapped driver. Very few people even knew that he was handicapped. Quite a success story during that period. I'll talk more here about the Couriers. The Courier was, in some ways, was an MGA. It used an MGA engine originally, later on the MGB. It was Nichols's big move into being a proper producer of road cars, and ultimately, though, these weren't really road cars. They were road cars meant for racing. Again, there was this element of no compromise. They weren't particularly comfortable for creature comforts. They were famous for the engine being located somewhat further back, so the cockpit was rather cramped. So the Courier was quite a cramped car, but it had a really good advantage. The power-to-weight ratio was spectacular. Even though it was cost a little more than the competing cars like the MGA, like the Triumph TR3, it became quite popular among people who wanted this kind of no-nonsense race car, something they could drive to the track, race, and drive home in the production categories. In many ways, the design of the Courier presaged the Spitfire. In fact, somebody who came up to me this morning and said, yes, a friend of mine sent me this photo, says, oh, look at this interesting Spitfire that ran at Vineland in New Jersey, but it wasn't a Spitfire, it was a Courier. They were often mistaken for that. When the Courier came online, there was a kind of a problem with Elva because they weren't really equipped. Remember, they were just drawing chalk lines on the floor. Now they actually had to do actual drawings, and they had to move to a bigger facility. It was no longer, they were behind a fish and chip shop initially. They had to move to a bigger facility. Initially, they moved to a facility in a drill hall that rented out. Eventually moved to Hastings itself. I mentioned that's where the Battle of Hastings took place. Later on, production would move on to Croydon near to London and be taken over by a company called Trojan. Frank Nichols had, I think, kind of an ambivalent relationship with the Courier. Hoped that they would be a cash cow. They never turned out that way. He never really wanted, he expected people to race them, but wasn't really there to support the racing activity. This is a period now, 1959 to 61, that the Courier was built. So it was a period of rapid growth for Elva. The Couriers themselves were built on later on, 62, 65, in different stages, and they were raced for many years after that. In fact, as recently as 2002, a Courier won the E-Production National Championship with SCCA. One of the key things about the Courier are some of the drivers involved. And we talked earlier about drivers such as Chuck Dietrich. Can't forget Susie Dietrich, who was in that rare sorority of really fine women drivers of the era. Susie Dietrich, Denise McCluggage, Pinky Rollo, Donna Mae Mims, Margaret Wiley would be another one. Her husband, Doc Wiley, was also a major Elva driver of that era. A few others of that era. But now we're moving on to the Courier. The Courier also was a great starting point for a number of drivers. People like John Kortz, John Cannon, Peter Revson, Jim Downing, who became a big, more recently in IMSA racing, got to start with a Courier. John Osteen, another IMSA driver much later, got to start with Courier. Nobody bigger than Mark Donahue, of course, who Michael has written quite a bit about. Mark Donahue got his start in Courier, this very kind of brutish car, which he won a national championship with. Couriers weren't, of course, the only thing going on. In fact, this became a very, very busy time for Elva. They were producing Couriers, still the sports racers, and they would slowly, surely move into Formula Junior as well. They produced, and Birdie touched on it, the later sports racers, and these became actually the last of the front-engine Elva sports racers, which were the Mark IV and the Mark V. This is really where Frank Nichols' passion remained, was still with the sports racers. The Mark IV was first independent rear suspension car that Elva built. It was actually a competitor to the Lotus 11. The Lotus 11 was, in terms of mass numbers, was the most common car. As Birdie mentioned, that class of racing was particularly popular in England, and the Mark IV was, to some degree, a competition with the Lotus 11. Mark IV was a more aerodynamic version of the earlier Elvas. Most of them were now fiberglass, not all of them, most of them were fiberglass. Very low built, again, mostly Climax engines, few Alfa Romeos, even one Buick engine. In fact, I spoke with a fellow here who has that car with the Buick engine. Bernie Keller was the original owner of that. One of the differences, though, with, say, the Mark IV, the Elva Mark IVs and the Lotus, is that the Elva was always considered a true club racer. As Birdie mentioned, you had to know what you're doing with an Elva. You had to tinker with it. You had to work with it. It was meant as a club racer, not really as a stepping stone kind of car. The Mark IV was also important. That was the first car that Carl Haas really got involved with, if I'm not mistaken. Birdie mentioned that that car won its class at Sebring in 1959. Second place to that car was the car driven by Birdie, that was driven with Carl Haas and was managed by none other than Tex Hopkins, also another famous figure here at Watkins Glen. One of the interesting comments, I think, always about these early Elvas, as Birdie mentioned, that they were kind of just put together. But even so, Chuck Dietrich was one that always thought that the Elvas were better than the Lotuses. Lotuses would have to be welded together between qualifying and the race. Elvas at least held together a little bit better than that. After the Mark IV came the Mark V, the very last of the front engines. It was even lower than the Mark IV, had arched wheels because it still retained the old 15-inch wheels. One of the things was that, again, Nichols, in his conservative way, didn't move to the smaller wheels that were common at that time, the 13-inch wheels. As I mentioned, that there was really three different kinds of production going on here. We have these Couriers, they're really gearing up, talked about the sports racers, and then there's Formula Junior. Remember, in motorsports, there's always this kind of tension between cost and competition. You try to keep the cost down. People develop new technologies, be more competitive. The cost goes back up. So it's always this kind of battle back and forth to try to keep costs down. And there were a number of formulas already existing in the 1950s that were intended to keep costs down, but they were usually basic, used motorcycle engines. 500cc would be one such class. The early Formula 3 was such. Johnny Laurani from Italy came up with this idea of the Formula Junior. Essentially, why not build more or less spec cars? It would be 1,000cc cars, later 1,100cc. Use production components, have them as single-seater cars, have the races on a kind of a national championship basis, get this approved by the FIA, and spread it around the world. The idea really caught on, and from about 1959 to 63, Formula Junior was the stepping stone of motorsports in that era. Stepping stone, also a lot of club racers. It was, you could be a junior Fangio or Scari or what have you in your Formula Junior. They looked like race cars. Italian cars typically had 1-liter Fiats in them, were garage built around that. There were French cars with DB Panhards. There were German cars with the 3-cylinder two-stroke DKWs. And then the English cars typically used BMC Austins. Nobody really jumped to the fore right away and built them in England. In fact, none of the countries had really constructors of Formula Juniors. But then Frank Nichols jumped in. And I believe some of the early conversations with that actually took place in Birdie's kitchen, where Frank saw a midget that Ed Crawford had brought over from the West Coast, a small midget racer from an amusement park. And that kind of gave Frank some ideas that later germinated in becoming the Formula Junior. Frank Nichols, Elva was the first to produce Formula Juniors in any kind of significant quantity. And it beat Cooper and Lotus. Cooper and Lotus at that time were very busy with their Formula One programs and really didn't pay much attention to Formula Junior. Also, the Formula Junior that Frank Nichols developed had an advantage when it came over to the U.S. because the U.S. caught on to Formula Junior right away. They were a little bit larger. Cockpit area was a little larger. Americans tend to be a little larger people than most Europeans, and it was very comfortable and convenient for that.
I would like to go back to one moment.
Sure.
Because you were talking about the...
There he is again.
I'm back again.
No, there he is again.
That was with the Mark IV too, but that was my own one there. That's one I did with the Lolas at that time. But the thing that happened was we had a number of friends in Chicago, in the Chicago region. Eddie Crawford lived quite close to me, and he was one of my best friends. We used to go over there, and it started out in his yard. He had 5 acres there, and the people had raised horses and that, and so they had jumps in their yard when he bought it. Well, he left them there. And we laid out a race course around those jumps in his yard. And we started out because somebody bought a Hinkle moped and somebody else had something, and we started racing in those mopeds. And one Sunday we were going up to Milwaukee, about 6 of us in the car, to a champ car race up there. And we were saying, wouldn't it be nice if we had some little cars we could race? And I said, wait a minute, I know. I saw an ad in the paper for a company that makes these things for carnivals and for off-road racing. They have a little Wisconsin engine in them and so forth. And so at that moment we said, well, who would buy one? And I said, I'll order them if you get enough guys. Well, we got 6 guys together. We ordered 6 of them. And we even included Wacky Arnold, who was the MG distributor in Chicago, without telling him, because we knew he'd buy anything, And anyhow, we bought those. And they came, and we had started racing in his yard with these things. And we had a ball with it. And then we actually even went on and had the fellow who built Meadowdale, Leonard Biesinger, who was really a housing builder at that time. And he built a shopping center, and he invited us out to race at his shopping center on Sundays, and he would get a great big crowd of people coming out there, and we were using up all of the wheelbarrow tires that we could find, because they'd only last a couple races or that. And that's how we got into that. Frank Nichols was coming over, so I took Frank over to Eddie's house, and we had a little race there, and Frank drove one of those little cars. He thought this was a lot of fun. And we said, Frank, what we need now is we need one with a shifter in it, and we need a car. And at that time, the van wall was the hot setup in Grand Prix racing. So we said, Frank, I said, I've got a picture of a van wall, and we just want to shrink that down and have it look like a van wall. You put some kind of a motorcycle, any motorcycle engine that's got a 5-speed gearbox or something. We don't want a big one. We said 250, and we said, go ahead and do this. This was kind of in the spring. Well, he started work on that car, and I remember the time he sent a letter to me and said, I was down to Italy, and Johnny Laurani has this new program down there for Formula Junior. He said, I'm going to make the car a little bit bigger, because then they can use it for Formula Junior also. When we got the first ones in, we said, my God, this is the biggest little car we ever saw in our life. But it was neat, and they drove nice. When I said I was an owner, I still own the first one I got, and I still own that. It's at my son's race shop and that, and he's been going to restore it all. It's probably only run in about 10 races. Major thing was I drove it in the first U.S. Grand Prix at Sebring. I drove it in the preliminary race that morning for the Formula Juniors, which was the first big Formula Junior race. I shouldn't get into going further, so I'll stop right now. But the thing was, it was about that time I decided I really wasn't going to do that much more racing. I'd just been married and my wife was pregnant, and I thought I'll just stop for a while. And Carl was anxious, and this is something I should have talked about before, how Carl got involved. Carl was a good friend of mine. We raced together and so forth. He was driving a Porsche, and he came down to Nassau with us one year. You know, in those days, Nassau would give you 2 rooms, so Al Ross and I were sleeping in mine. But Carl didn't have anybody with him, and so he had an empty bed in his room at the hotel. Frank Nichols came over. We didn't know for sure that he was coming, but Frank came over. He said, Carl, can you put up Frank in your bedroom? He said, sure. Well, they got talking at night when they were laying in the beds there talking, and Frank Nichols sold Carl a car at that time. He had a Porsche, and he sold him a car, and Frank told him about this wonderful thing. He had been to Massachusetts. The fellow Candy Poole was his name up there, who had designed a 4-EMO carburetor manifold for the Coventry Climax engine, and he was sure that that would give you 15 horsepower more than you were getting out of the stock one. Carl wanted the car like that with the Candy Poole manifold on it. Well, when it came, it wasn't that much faster, if it was any faster at all, and that was in a Mark III body. But Carl got very interested in this thing, and he wanted to get involved in the sale of those cars. At the time, he was working for the Ford Motor Company in a training program for middle-line people. Carl came to me and he said, I want to get involved. I said, okay, Carl, you now work for me. You're a salesman, and you get a commission when you sell them. We didn't make much money on the cars anyhow. We made more money really on the parts in those days. So Carl came. At this time, Nichols was having a bit of a problem. He had some cars that had been ordered by a dealer whose name rhymes with Dixon. They were sitting on a dock down in Florida, and I said, Carl, here's your first assignment. You go down there, and you see if you can't sell those cars down there somewhere. And he did, and he went over, because he knew Jim Hall pretty well. He went over to Texas, and he sold Jim Hall one, and one of Jim's other friends, not Sharp, but another fellow, that he sold 2 juniors that were sitting there. So that's how Carl got involved. When he came back, I said, Carl, I'm going to step out of the sale of the cars. Why don't you just take it on? You can pay me whatever you want out of it, whatever you make something. I don't know. He did give me some money, believe it or not, but it was pretty informal. But I said, I want to keep the Coventry Climax business and that. And so I did that for quite a while before I sold that part of it to him, too. So that's how Carl got involved. Sorry.
Oh, I love it.
We
I love
didn't
it,
ever
Bertie.
get enough time to really spend time to get together.
Right. That's great. I never knew the end of that story as to what happened with that car. Just said I know it became an ad for Johnny Walker Bourbon, though. Yeah. Well, we've alluded to these problems with Walt Dixon, and basically the issue there is that, remember, you got a shoestring operation, Elva. It's basically living hand to mouth. Nichols has been living hand to mouth. So, for that matter, was Walt Dixon with his dealership in the D.C. area. And, in fact, he started playing quite a shell game with his cars. And his deal with Nichols is he was going to prepay for this big order of Couriers, but after a while the checks weren't coming or they were bouncing. Well, the same thing was happening with the creditors that Dixon had, that he wasn't paying them. And after a while he was doing shell games where he would, to get more loans, to increase his letter of credit with the bank, he would do these games where he would use the cars as collateral and then have his customers come back with their cars to do servicing, and then when the bank came around to make sure that the cars were actually there as inventory, there they were, but they had already been sold. So he had all sorts of ways of doing this. Well, eventually that caught up with him, and in December of '59 he was visited by a certain team of U.S. Marshals, and that closed the Dixon enterprise, and that had immediate repercussions on Frank Nichols and Elva back in England. He was basically left holding the bag. No more income coming. And it was the worst possible time because the production was ramping up with all the Couriers, Formula Juniors, the various sports racers. Was it the end of Elva? Well, of course not. It was really just kind of, in some ways, the midpoint. Elva recovered quite quickly, really thanks to 3 different people or 3 different organizations. One, as we heard, Carl Haas. Carl Haas stepped to the plate and invested a lot in the restructured Elva, which was called Elva Cars 1961 Limited. Another fellow was a guy named Frank Webb, who ran a company called Rytune Engineering. He stepped to the plate and built some of those last of the front engine Formula Junior cars that you saw. Those were called Scorpions. They were built out of the Elva plant, but because of this liquidation process, they couldn't be called Elvas. They were somewhat different, actually, than the original Elva 100s, as they were called, the Formula Juniors. And then the other company that came into play was Trojan. Trojan had been around since something like 1910, involved in a variety of automotive enterprises. Most recently, at that time, was the importer of Lambretta scooter from Italy. And they also, in fact, were involved with a big go-karting operation in the United States, sold many, many go-karts. They took on the production of the Courier. So essentially all the post-1961 Couriers were actually built by Trojan, which is located in Croydon near London. Pretty soon now, Elva's back on its feet, and they're producing cars again. They're producing another round of Formula Junior cars, and you kind of quickly saw some of those. These were the rear-engine Formula Junior cars, because by that time, front engines were obsolete in Formula Junior as they were in Formula One. The rear-engine Formula Junior is called the 200, later the 300. The 200 ones with that vertical fin. The 300s are the very, very low, boxy ones. The thing about all the Formula Junior cars is they came to be driven by some significant people, particularly here in the United States. Bob Bondurant drove one at one point. Charlie Kolb won a championship with the Formula Juniors. The rear-engine Formula Junior, one of those was driven by Mark Donahue. He didn't have as much success with that as he did with the Courier, but it was a major, major stepping stone for Donahue that carried forward later into a single-seater career. It also kind of coincided with more or less a general fading of Formula Junior. Formula Junior suffered this fate of a lot of these low-cost formulas. Basically, somebody got in there and took it all over. In this case, it was Lotus. The Lotus 18, and not only was the Lotus 18 more successful than Elva or anybody else and dominated the formula, but they also brought in factory teams. Jimmy Clark and a number of others drove Formula Junior cars, so it really defeated the very purpose of that. Now we have this shift to the rear for Elva. Very significant. Time to join the modern age. You have the engine in the rear. So there are now two things going on. The Formula Junior era was over. Trojan is taking over the production of the Couriers. Elva, meaning Frank Nichols, Keith Marsden themselves, can focus a little more, again, on what they really love, which is two-seater sports racers, and now they're all rear engine from here on out. The Mark VI being the first one. The Mark VIs, again, very often climax engines. They were successful pretty much from the onset. One of Elva's heydays came at Boxing Day, that's the day after Christmas, in 1961, when Chris Ashmore almost defeated Graham Hill's Testarossa at Brands Hatch. And this is a real high point. It really made people take notice again, just like they did very early on with the Elva Potential, the Elva. And Elva got a lot of orders as a result of that. Also, a lot of characters, again, though, endlessly stories of characters and all this. We'll see in a moment Dan Blocker. But before Dan Blocker, there was a fellow, Tony Lanfranchi, in the UK, who was another one of these characters. He came to Frank Nichols and boldly said, I want to be your factory driver. And Frank Nichols said, no, I don't do that. Lanfranchi went out to the casino down the road, won a bunch of money that night, came back the next day and bought his car with all the coins and all, and went racing. At one point, his transporter broke. He was on his way to an international race in the UK, and his transporter broke down along the way. So he did the only sensible thing. He pulled his Elva out of the back of the transporter and started driving to the circuit, unmuffled and all. Well, the local constabulary didn't take kindly to this, stopped him. He convinced the policeman that rather than book him, it would really be best interest of England in this major international race if he would receive a police escort to the race. And he did. So that shows you a kind of talking point it could be. Another character, the whole story of Elva here is, as you can see, Dan Blocker. I believe that's Linda Vaughn with him. And Dan Blocker, of course, the Bonanza actor, who became involved with the Elva Mark VI. He had a couple of Mark VIs, one of which he put a Maserati engine into it. And in fact, both of his cars featured in this particular film, Viva Las Vegas, with Elvis and Anne Margaret. So we have Elvis and Elva tied together, conveniently enough. In fact, it's interesting because Blocker's Maserati engine never ran particularly well. So for the film, they actually had these two identically painted Elvas. This one with, I believe, a Coventry Climax that was actually used in the action sequences in the film. And the other one, which was only in the garage, and you see the engine lifted out of that, which is the Maserati, which is very appropriate because that's usually the condition that that particular car was in. Another thing about Dan Blocker's team is he very often used a driver by the name of Bill Harris. Bill Harris was actually a stunt man from the Hollywood area, but Dan Blocker, of course, knew him from his professional connections. And if any of you have read Sylvia Wilkinson's great book, The Stainless Steel Carrot, which is pretty much mostly about John Morton, but there's this great little vignette in there about Bill Harris. And Bill Harris would organize these stunts for the movies, and he had this one particular stunt, and I think it might have been at Daytona, where he had to catapult the car over the rail. So you arrange this all with a catapult and put a dummy in the car and all that, and the film crew ready, and the car got vaulted over the rail. And then he went out in his pickup truck to go retrieve this car. Well, as he went outside the track, he noticed that a crowd had kind of gathered around, civilians from driving around the area. They thought that, here's this terrible racing accident that just has happened. Of course, Bill Harris figured out what's going on here. He runs up to this car, this crash, pulls out this lifeless driver, and starts punching. This is, you dirty so-and-so, look what you did to my race car. So there, all these characters. This particular Elva Mark VI that you see here, nothing particularly significant historically about this. It's actually driven in a series in the Midwest, Midwestern Council of Sports Car Clubs. You might have noticed in some of these shots it has kind of almost a Ferrari-esque rebodying to it. That was designed by these two brothers, Dave and Dean Causey, in the late 1960s. And the Causeys were known for, they jumped into the big dune buggy craze that was going on at that period. Wanted to make a lot of money on dune buggies. So they built a bunch of dune buggies. The only problem is that their source of the chassis for these dune buggies were stolen VW Beetles. They just go out in the street, steal VW Beetles, convert them into dune buggies, and sell them. They quickly graduated into manufacturing license plates after that, so that was a short. I love these particular sequence of shots because this is now the Courier Marks 3 and 4 that were built by Trojan, and it shows you some of the advertising that was used. Don't ask me why they did this particular pose. But there are all these shots. There are also, I think, maybe some shots I don't have in there of bathing beauties in the English winter posed on some of these cars. As you can see, not all the Couriers were roadsters. Couriers had a very unique, this reversed rake coupe that they developed. Very few of those were built, and they are among the most sought-after cars right now in the Courier collector market. Couriers were also somewhat similar in concept to the sports racers, that virtually no two were alike. There were constant variations of the suspension types. So there were 2+2 seating arrangements, there were the coupes, there were the roadsters, all these constant variants. Because I was never quite sure, is this a road car, is this a race car, is it primarily a road car, primarily a race car? Nobody ever quite came to grips with that, which was actually, in many ways, it's failing, if you might say. And in fact, it's something that frustrated Carl Haas later, because he was the principal importer of the Couriers to the U.S., and he was really frustrated by this idea that it was constantly switching back and forth. There was one last Courier that was kind of an interesting story. This is a Le Mans Courier coupe. There was two American expats in France, one military, one non-military, who raced Couriers with each other, and they had a really good time. And over some Vin Rouge one night, they decided they were going to enter Le Mans, Ron Lutz and Dick Osteen. And they hatched this idea over napkins, but this one sort of worked, unlike most napkin-hatched ideas that we have. They ordered a car from, at that point, Peter Agg from Trojan. Came as more or less a bag of bits. They got a local technical college to put it all together. Found when they got to Le Mans that windscreen cracked right away. They got a Renault windscreen to replace it. The problem then still was that the windshield wipers wouldn't even touch the screen, but they kind of solved these things one by one. They also had the interesting things that went on that day. That they had a problem with a bad shimmy in the alignment. So they took it to a local shop that was just kind of the beginnings of electronic alignment for wheels. Didn't help at all. And there was this guy in the next paddock stall over, heard all this going on, and said, I think I can fix it as a Dunlop technician, I think. And he just kind of picked up the wheel, put it on a stand, rolled it, took a weight off here, put a weight on there, gave it back to him. They expected the worst, and the car handled brilliantly after that. They still failed. They still didn't make the start, and it was kind of one of the last times that Elva tried to run at Le Mans. The last of the rear engine series that were pure Elvas were the Mark 7s and the Mark 8s. These were now thoroughly modern cars at this point. They were much more professional. They were lightweight, very, very lightweight. really designed from scratch as rear-engine cars, whereas the Mark VI was more or less a front-engine car turned around. They were dealt with actually problems such as grip and the like, which was a new concept at that time. They still used primarily Climax and Ford engines. In fact, it's interesting because later on in the history of many of these cars, they got Hondas, Datsun, VWs installed in them. But what really became interesting is when the 7s became the Mark 7S's. This is about 1963 or so. Again, there was an engine supply issue, so Nichols at that point opted for BMW engines. The BMW, which is not yet a household name in the U.S., was considered to be a very reliable, very easy to fit in the car. It was quite easy to reconfigure the car for the BMW engine. It was a 2-liter dry-sumped engine that they used. Tony Lanfranchi again comes into play. He was a champion with this particular BMW engine here. The BMW engine also was about that same time that Ollie Schmidt, who was the Porsche importer to the U.S., watched an Elva race at Puerto Rico along with Hirschka von Hanstein of Porsche. They were quite impressed by that. They thought, maybe we should adopt some of these concepts to the Porsche, because at that time the Porsche Spiders, the sports racing Spiders, were a little long in the tooth. They were reliable, but they were heavy. They were not doing particularly well. So they took this idea actually back to Ferry Porsche about maybe doing something together with Elva. Porsche was always very conservative about any other constructor using their engines. But they thought, well, maybe this is a good idea. And thus was born the Elva Porsche. The Elva Porsche became actually sort of the last great highlight of Elva history, came with the Elva Porsche. Developed partly by Herbert Linga, the very famous Porsche test driver, helped a lot in setting this up. There's a lot of reconfiguring of the chassis that had to go on to fit Porsche engine into it. It was brought over in August of 1963 to the U.S., just in time for the Road America 500, which at that stage was one of the major endurance races in the U.S. And it was now waged against big bore cars, Cobras, Ferraris, and the like were running in this race. Bill Wiesthoff, great American driver from the Midwest, started the race. Frank Nichols was there, one of his many but still sporadic visits to the U.S. Immediately, this was a success from the start of the race, actually from qualifying on. It was fast, and more importantly, it was very, very fuel efficient. There was a problem with a co-driver. They didn't have a co-driver nominated. Carl Haas at one point was going to drive, but he and Westhoff are so different in physical size that Carl didn't quite fit in the car. They ended up at the end of the day deciding on Augie Paps as a co-driver. Augie had never driven the car before. He stepped out of Roger Penske's Ferrari, and when Bill Wiesthoff came in halfway through the race in the lead, handed the car over to Augie. Augie had never driven the car before, spun off at the first lap, slowly gained confidence, and ended up winning the race. It was one of the great moments of Elva. First big 2-liter win for a car in a major endurance race like that, and it was a win for Elva. Immediately led to a large order of Elva Porsches. And it's actually interesting because in terms of Porsche history, it's maybe the only non-Porsche built chassis that is accepted as a Porsche. Lessons that Porsche learned from that were put to use later on when they built the other space frame Porsches, the 908, the 917s, and the like. Kind of last of the true Elvas, as it were, was the GT 160, and this is a very special, not one-off, but three-off, built on a Mark 7S chassis, but with a coupe body, a very nicely styled coupe body, designed by a guy, call him two names, either Trevor Frost, Trevor Fiore. He just thought that Trevor Fiore di Torino sounds better than Trevor Frost of Leighton Buzzard. And so he just went with this kind of Italianate name that he created and designed this car called the GT 160, of which only 3 were built. And again, in sort of typical fashion for small constructors of this type, they misjudged some of the calculations on the weights, they misjudged some of the calculations on cost, and as a result, the car never went into production. All 3 of those cars do survive. One of them went on and raced at Le Mans the following year, not with a whole lot of success, but it was always a very attractive car. Elva's story doesn't quite end there because it really ends with McLaren. Bruce McLaren, when he first was thinking about starting his own race team and was actually thinking of constructing sports racers, thought, I can construct the basic idea, but I can't make customer cars. So he came to the group now led by Peter Agg, which was the CEO of Trojan, and asked them and worked out an arrangement with them to build the original McLarens, which became known as the McLaren Elvas, the M1A. At a time, this is now 65, 66, when Group 7 racing, big bore sports racing is becoming popular, not just in the U.S., but also in Europe. Build a series of 25 customer cars for me, Bruce McLaren saying. And this became sort of the last, the real story of Elva kind of ends there with the McLaren Elva. There were a series of other McLaren Elvas built that usually never were called McLaren Elvas, usually only went by the name of McLaren. They were the kind of the last chapter of the Elva story. Elva does live on in a number of different ways. Frank Nichols himself went on, became part of a partnership with Len Terry and Carl Haas called Transatlantic Consultants. They helped develop some of the BRMs of the late 1960s, a King Cobra in the late 1960s. So he kept his hand in with other automotive concerns, although later he really moved into boat building, built boats that were used for various rescue and fishing services in Britain. Nichols became very active in sort of the next phase of Elva, which was its afterlife, if you will. Elva became and remains today one of the most popular cars in vintage and historic racing. One of the nice things about most of the Elvas that you've seen in this, almost all of these still exist. Very few were destroyed. Almost all still exist. And almost all can be found in vintage racing of one kind or another. One of the first people who really stoked this flame was Sterling Moss. Sterling Moss's first vintage racing car when he got back in the sport in the 1980s was indeed an Elva Mark 7S. And he, to this day, remains a real champion of Elva and the history of Elva, which is one of the reasons he wrote the foreword to the book. Another key player in this kind of late stage of Elva, he was mentioned at the beginning, was Roger Dunbar. Roger Dunbar owns the Elva name, supplies the spares, as many of you who deal with Elvas know. He's actually involved in the project in bringing Elva back again, the recreation of Elva, and a brand new Elva Courier. Remains to be seen if that's going to be done, if the investment is there for it. Roger is also involved in restoring. He restored a Mark II recently that now resides in the museum at Bexhill. But if you were to go over to that McLaren sitting over in the lobby in the research center, if you look at the cellular level, there might be a little bit of the DNA of a little shop that began behind a hotel, began a fish and chip shop. There were the chalk lines on the floor. That McLaren in there, its origins do date back to the shop in Bexhill on Sea. So with that, thank you very much.
You can stay up here a minute. What a wonderful presentation, led by Janos and augmented by Birdie. What a treat for all of us. Janos is such a pro. He brought it in right on time. We are going to do some Q&A. We're going to bring Birdie up for that as well. We're going to take a few questions and answers. And by the way, that wonderful photo of Birdie up on two wheels is by Ron Nelson, who has been a big supporter here of the Research Center. So I wanted to get his name in there. But Birdie, I'll start it out. How did you manage to get along simultaneously with Bernie Ecclestone, Jean-Pierre Blest, Max Mosley, Colin Chapman, and all the other renegades of motorsports?
It's a good question. I'm not sure how I did it myself, but I like people, and that's one of the reasons I like Elva, because Elva had the nicest people to work with, and it was always fun to have a guy call, and that was the problem. Somebody wanted the Pistons or something. We'd spend more time talking about different things and what was going on and that. No, I really meant to bring that into this. The Elva people just turned out to be great people to work with. And it's continued to those of you who have bought them in recent years and that. It's the same kind of group of people that's really fun to be with and talk about the cars. So,
any questions from the floor?
There's been a rumor that one of the gentlemen owns the original Elva that Mark Donahue had as a toy. Is that a fact?
That it's what?
Well, he owned it as a toy. He just liked it as a personal property. And he had an Elva that he stored around his home.
Well, I'm aware of the Elva. You mean the Courier that he raced, or a different Courier?
One of his early models.
I know one that he drove on the road.
As his biographer, that may be true, but I missed it if it's so. Sorry.
I know of his race car, which I saw some photographs earlier somebody had of one that was painted up as Mark's original car, but I don't believe that is actually the chassis that he had, because my understanding is his race Courier, and I'm not sure about nothing about a road Courier, but his race Courier sort of disappeared into the overall fabric of American racing as years went on before people realized that it was Mark Donahue's car. I know it passed on to a fellow whose surname is Gaunt, G-A-N-U-T, I think Robert Gaunt, who raced it for a while, but then it disappeared after that.
That would be, he's from Fort Wayne, Indiana. Yeah, Harry Gaunt. Harry Gaunt.
Okay.
In fact, he was my wife's jeweler.
Oh, okay. By the way, just one administrative note I was going to mention. There were some films here we didn't have a chance to show. They primarily show Susie Dietrich. They're from the Susie Dietrich archive, and there's one actually that shows the British Racing Show of 1960, kind of a nice period piece. And I want to put in a plug, another book to get is Michael's book, because you want, again, this idea of people and racing. The Formula One at Watkins Glen, 1961-81, is a real treasure in that regard. So,
Thank you. I don't see any questions coming from the audience. I will say this about that Courier. Let me just finish this point, Tim, and I want to get your question. That may be true that it went into the mist, that Courier, but there are people who believe that car did exist. And when we had the Mark Donahue reunion here 3 years ago, that car was there. His son Michael drove it. That car then was sold to Janos Wimpffen, who took it to Austria. And Johannes has an interesting hobby. In addition to a lot of great classic race cars, he also collects the first race cars of famous race car drivers, if you can imagine that. Tim.
The records were lost in a fire, so that's why I spent probably finding out about some of this. Any just estimates like what the total number of sports racers, careers, and juniors were like?
right. I think the records lost in the fire might be somewhat there. It seems like that happens a lot. The records are lost in fires, and you're looking for. So I can probably write a whole chapter about records lost in fires. I think it was more records lost because we don't want HM revenue to find out what really went on. That was probably more what really happened. But the records are really confusing with Elva production. And the number one reason for that is not because of any skullduggery, but because of unfinished kits coming out the door. You have finished cars coming out the door. You have some that were supposed to go out, kits came back in the door and were finished, sent out. So because of the nature of this kind of hodgepodge industry, records weren't kept that closely. And then add to that these issues with the Dixon saga, the Dixon problem, recovery after that, Trojan coming into play. You have all kinds of opportunities for things to go awry and record keeping. I mean, that had a lot to do. But to answer your question about numbers, as best we can tell, there were about 700-800 Couriers built of all stripes, and this includes actually a handful that were built way after the Trojan era, because Trojan then handed it off to a fellow named Ken Shepard, then handed it off to a fellow named Tony Ellis, and they built a few cars after, just a handful. But the number 800 fits. Juniors, that's actually, I don't know the number in my head, but the juniors happen to be the one that we're pretty well documented on, and it's right around 100 in total of the 3 different kinds of juniors. Actually 4 if you include Scorpion. I don't have that in my head, but I know that number is pretty concrete. The sports racers, in the neighborhood of 300 to 400. Some of those, with the later ones, 6, 7, 8. We know the numbers exactly. Earlier ones, no, that's where we get into those kit car problems.
You raise a point there, and I'm going to ask both of you. Are you aware that there is a controversy that maybe there is someone in England or somewhere else who is manufacturing historic race cars and passing them off as Sterling Moss's car? And is anyone doing this with Elva? Is any clever mechanic who had built Elvas at one time, are they manufacturing new ones that they're passing off?
No, because Elvas aren't that valuable after all. We have this wonderful cult following of Elvas, but they're not Ferraris. That problem exists with Ferraris, Cobras, Ford GTs, Coopers, Coopers, to some Lolas. It happens with a number of, some of them actually are licensed. In some cases, like Lola, for example, now is licensed what they call continuation, license somebody to build it, so those are legit. But then you get in this problem of, okay, they're built just like the old cars. Are they the same as the old cars? They're built with modern techniques and all. It gets into all these issues. There's a couple different problems with that. One is there is the fraud aspect where people try to pass off a car as having this and this provenance, and it really doesn't. And that happens over and over again. I've been involved in some of those cases, in fact. And then there is the other kind of aspect, which is, well, we want to build this continuation, but now where are you going to race these things? Because the different vintage and historic sanctioning bodies, they have a wide variety of rules. Some are very, very strict. This particular car you raced, the car itself must have documented history of having done X, Y, and Z. Other sanctioning bodies are much looser. They'll say, we'll accept cars that have been modified, modernized in some way. We'll also accept cars that have been built as a continuation. So there's an issue, too, of what you can do with these cars besides just what their particular provenance is.
I got involved in a lot of this just recently because after I retired, my wife had done most of the papers for historic cars for the FIA in the United States. She wanted to continue doing that because she enjoyed talking with the people and so forth. And so when we retired, my successor, Nick Craw, asked if we wouldn't continue doing that. And I said yes, but I didn't want to do inspections because I didn't want to travel. And we used Jeremy Hall, who was the FIA inspector that inspected all the cars for us. And we got involved in a number of those. We didn't have any problems that I can recall on any Elvas at all. But we did have a lot of them on other cars. And the FIA had a procedure. They started out doing it for a historic papers called Heritage Program. And it was fairly expensive because it required the car to be, regardless of where the car was located, you had to have an inspector go out to it, had to go back, and generally it took a couple times to do it. And if there was any other car or any other person that claimed the provenance of the car that you had, they would not accept either one of them until it was resolved. And it got kind of difficult. I actually have a Cooper still that I'm the only owner of the car. I bought it from Reg Parnell, and he was the original buyer of the car. It was a race team, and I bought it from him. And it's been in my garage almost completely since that time. Yet we know of one in England that has claiming the same numbers on it. You know, the sad part, when these were first built, we didn't look into the things that you all look into now. We knew the cars because we knew it was a red Elva. So-and-so owned it. And if he put a blue stripe on it, it was the red Elva with the blue stripe. Nobody ever asked about a serial number or anything. It's really a shame that we didn't do more. But I think on the first Elvas we get, I remember the only thing I saw that had a number on it, and I'm not sure, looked like a little tin strip that you'd get at an arcade for $0.25, where you could print your name on a piece of metal or something. And I think Frank would go down to the arcade and get them made when he needed them. And it was really kind of funny. It's sad, but it makes it interesting, too. If it was all cut and dried and we knew where everyone was and everything that it had done, it'd be different. But it's fun. You know, there are people that collect cars just to do that sort of thing. They don't care about racing them or anything. They like to look at them, and they love enjoying the history of them. And it's kind of fun when you find out your car had some kind of provenance to it.
Comment on that. It's interesting about how, this thing about chassis numbers and so forth is an issue now because of the cars have become valuable. And then when you do dig through the history, there are all these problems come about for a variety of reasons that Birdie mentioned. And many of them have to do with legal issues back in the day because, particularly before the onset of the European Union, crossing every border in Europe, you had to show that the car has left and entered the country. And so the documentation had to match the chassis number. But if you crashed a car, that means you still had to export that car. So you take the plate off and put it onto another car. That kind of switching went on all the time. And it goes on today. I follow current racing quite a bit because of the writing that I do. And there was a particular car in an ALMS race that was crashed at Lime Rock. And a week later, the next race at Mid-Ohio, I was there. And the team had this brand new car. And I went up to him, I said, I want to get the chassis number of your new car. And the guy tells me the chassis number. And I said, no, that's the one you crashed last week. He goes, no, that's this one. And I said, no, that can't be. You've got a new car here. He goes, no, we repaired it. And I said, wait a minute. I was there at Lime Rock. It was badly damaged. It was destroyed. You didn't repair that car. He goes, no, we repaired it. And I said, no. And I looked, and sure enough, it had the same chassis number I saw a week earlier. And I said, well, how can I have the same chassis number? He says, well, we sent it back to Germany. They repaired it. They sent it back to us. It's a repaired car. No customs duties paid. I got that.
Jürgen Barth, let me just tell you. Jürgen Barth told me that Porsche even did the same thing. They built a lot of race cars, team cars, and none of them had plates of their own. They just would move them from whatever they were taking them with. And that's a company as big as Porsche.
We have a question back here. Yes.
Do you really know anything about Gus Hutchinson racing the Courier early in racing?
Yes, the name shows up.
Gus was 5,000 drive. Well, I know he drove very successfully in the Continental Series at one time and that. I don't ever remember him in a Courier. And
I worked in a parking lot in 1962, I think it was, in Atlanta. So he'd come in with a Courier with racing Robar. I think he was racing.
Well, there were quite a few of them down in Atlanta, and it may be some place he worked or somebody he knew or something, but it's possible.
The name very much rings a bell, and I believe he's in my database that comes with the book.
We can probably take one here. Dave, introduce yourself.
I'm Dave Wild. We have an Elva Courier that I started racing after racing an MGTD for quite a few years. The Courier we were racing early 60s into mid 60s anyway. This is a story that I never shared with my wife until many years later. It had been raining for 3 days down here at Watkins Glen. At that time, we were still doing standing starts. False grid was mud at that time, curious mix of Watkins Glen clay and the oil leaks of 1,000 British cars that had gone before. It was kind of a sticky mess at that time. They slowly put us out on the grid. And when the flag fell, I pulled a good starting position in the second row, staggered just behind a Porsche 356. As the flag fell, the 356 spun its tires, unloaded its load of mud directly in my face because we're sitting kind of exposed in an Elva Courier. Initially, I let off on the gas almost immediately, then instantaneously got back on it, because I realized there were 100 cars behind me at 100 miles an hour. We had to get moving, so I put my foot back down. I could not see a thing. Trying to get enough water off the cowl of the car to clear the mud off my visor, and was unsuccessful for a while. But just on instinct alone and experience running the course there, I managed to come up from the old start-finish line, up the hill, through the S's, and out onto the straight before I could see again.
Great story. Great story.
It was hairy. One other time, I was up on the back straight, and somehow or another it collided with a bird. It must have been a crow, because all I could see was black feathers. It spun the helmet sideways to cover one eye, and it felt like a pterodactyl, not a crow. But thank you.
Well, with that, I'm going to say very special thanks to Burdette Martin, to Janos Wimpffen, and to all of you for being here today for a great presentation.
This episode is brought to you in part by the International Motor Racing Research Center. Its charter is to collect, share, and preserve the history of motorsports, spanning continents, eras, and race series. The center's collection embodies the speed, drama, and camaraderie of amateur and professional motor racing throughout the world. The center welcomes serious researchers and casual fans alike to share stories of race drivers, race series, and race cars captured on their shelves and walls and brought to life through a regular calendar of public lectures and special events. To learn more about the center, visit www.racingarchives.org. This episode is also brought to you by the Society of Automotive Historians. They encourage research into any aspect of automotive history. The SAH actively supports the compilation and preservation of papers, organizational records, print ephemera, and images to safeguard, as well as to broaden and deepen the understanding of motorized wheeled land transportation through the modern age and into the future. For more information about the SAH, visit www.autohistory.org.
We hope you enjoyed another awesome episode of Break Fix Podcast, brought to you by Grand Touring Motorsports. If you'd like to be a guest on the show or get involved, be sure to follow us on all social media platforms at Grand Touring Motorsports. And if you'd like to learn more about the content of this episode, be sure to check out the follow-on article at gtmotorsports.org. We remain a commercial-free and no annual fees organization through our sponsors, but also through the generous support of our fans, families, and friends through Patreon. For as little as $2.50 a month, you can get access to more behind-the-scenes action, additional pit stop minisodes, and other VIP goodies, as well as keeping our team of creators fed on their strict diet of Fig Newtons, gummy bears, and Monster. So consider signing up for Patreon today at www.patreon.com/GT Motorsports. And remember, without you, none of this would be possible.